Hello, welcome to the GW Books Club, where me and my friend Stu are reading all of the original fiction published by Games Workshop in the late 80s and early 90s. This month, we have read Comeback Tour by Jack Yeovil, which is Kim Newman's pen name. This is the final part of his Dark Future saga. Sadly, a saga that would go incomplete. It is a tremendous story, a really fun adventure that is absolutely out there and completely wild. But before we get into our discussion, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the story. In an alternative future history of 1999, the dark designs of Elder Seth Newman move ever forward. His Josephite cult have taken over the flooded remains of NASA's Cape Canaveral in the Florida swamplands, and they intend to reactivate an abandoned government satellite, a laser defense network that can kill anyone on Earth in mere moments. Elsewhere in the bio, a Gentech Biodivision facility has been experimenting on indentees, slaves by another name, in an effort to combine human and reptile DNA. The tests go better than the docs ever imagined, and soon the alligator and dinosaur human hybrids, known as the Suitcase People, rebel against their captors and take over the entire base. At their head is Hiroshi Shiba, a Gentech executive that was always more human and decent than his compatriots, but who is ironically now more alligator than man. Into this dangerous swamp of cultists and mutants steps sanctioned operative Elvis Aaron Presley. Formerly a rock and roll legend, Elvis joined the military in the 60s and never looked back. In an increasingly lawless land, Elvis remains a bulwark against the darkness, fighting against corrupt operatives, gang cults, and a resurgent KKK. Elvis is hired by Crocodile, the woman formerly known as Jasmine Bonet, because she wants his help on a mission to Cape Canaveral. She doesn't know what exactly they will need to do there, but she is certain that something terrible is about to happen. And she also knows that in order to stop it, she's going to need Elvis to rediscover some of his long-forgotten magic. She will need him to make music. Stu, good evening. We are back once again for the GW Books Club. We're talking about Dark Futures. Well, not the final Dark Future story, but certainly the final Kim Newman writing as Jack Yeovil story. And it's not actually the last story. It's just the last one that was published. And it's Comeback Tour. It is it's hard to describe what this novel is about. I guess you could start by saying it is about Elvis as a sanctioned operative, and he fights against the KKK, and he fights against giant mutant alligator men, and there's all sorts of fun stuff in there. How did you find it? How did you find this adventure?
It's pretty wild, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
it's good, really good fun. As you'd expect from Kim Newman writing Dark Future. It's more of the stuff we've loved from the previous books written by him. More of that really fun take on the Dark Future world and universe, and filled with all of his sort of fun flavor parts, which are sort of news articles, TV shows, all of that kind of fun stuff that he puts in, all that satirical humor. And it's great fun. The actual main story is quite straightforward, really, but it's just filled with all of that other flavor stuff, really, that really brings it to life, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting because it's, in the last story that we read as part of this, so it's the Demon Download cycle. That's what he called, I think it was supposed to be 5 books in total. This one is essentially the penultimate sort of series of events before you were going to get the final kind of millennial event. It was going to take place on Y2K. So this is just before that, and it is putting some of the final pieces in place for various prophecies, various sort of, the bad guys getting really bad and the good guys getting really good and meeting up. But you're right, the story itself, relatively simple. Essentially, Elvis gets recruited by Crocodile, who we saw in the previous adventure, Crocodile Tears. She recruits Elvis to go to Cape Canaveral, which is actually now under swamp water, or a couple of feet of swamp water at least, because of it's all been flooded now. And they're going for some reason, and she doesn't even not even Crocodile quite knows what the reason is. So you get a bit of a road, like a road story and an adventure to get to Cape Canaveral, but we also get a couple of parallel stories as well, don't we? We get what's happening nearby at a Gentech biodivision facility where they've accidentally or maybe on purpose created some alligator mutants and dinosaur mutants, which is quite an interesting and fun kind of body horror story. And then you've also got this third story, which is Duroc, who we have been introduced to previously, who's the bad guy, Elder Seth's right-hand man. So he's the villainous sort of second in command. He has gone to Cape Canaveral to reactivate an old NASA program, which is essentially a satellite in space that can target anyone on Earth and vaporize them.
Laser.
Yeah, lasers. Yeah. So you kind of got these three parallel stories, and obviously they're all sort of working towards this final battle you're going to get at Cape Canaveral. Yeah. I mean, just taking I guess if we start with just the Elvis, let's start with Elvis. In fact, I mean, what are your feelings about this novel being about Elvis?
There were points where I was a little bit uncomfortable with it. Not uncomfortable with any problems with the writing or anything like that, or even the subject matter. Was just that was it taking me out of the story a little bit, with it being such a famous singer. I mean, I'm not an Elvis fan. I don't know an awful lot about Elvis, but when I was growing up, Elvis was still very much a prominent thing. So every gift shop you went to, along with a Michael Jackson calendar, there would always be an Elvis calendar. This has changed now. You don't see, you don't see it so much anymore, but it was very front and center. It was such a big thing. So it feels like something that's been around all of my life. So I wasn't really sure how I felt about that versus just a made up character. I spent the early parts of the story thinking, would I have preferred it? If it was just a normal sanctioned op, if such thing exists. Would the story still work? Yes, it would. But the fun bits that he interlaces into his story, the way he sings at the end, and it's funny. If you just say it out loud, it sounds utterly ridiculous. It really does. But somehow he gets away with it. But he gets away with it, and I come away thinking, I'm glad it was Elvis. That was funny, and it was well done. And it shows a lot of his skill to be able to turn an absolutely ridiculous idea into something that actually worked in this alternate universe. I love that Elvis is what Elvis was before he went off the rails. So again, I don't know lots about Elvis, but you get the idea of different stages of Elvis' career. When he was younger, when he was doing the film stuff, the early films, it was very much a huge star, good looking man, healthy, went to the army, etc. And then there was that post period with the Elvis everyone thinks of, overweight, dying on a toilet or whatever happened. But he's not become that Elvis. He stayed the good Elvis, if that makes sense. So forgive anyone who's into Elvis and knows what I'm talking about is absolute rubbish. But, that's a really basic version of it. But he comes back and he doesn't continue his music career, and he goes on to do good he's a good op, isn't he? He's got a real heart to him. He's got real morals. I quite like that, and that's what saved it, I think. It's fine. It was fine. There were a couple of moments I thought, do I like this? This is a little weird. But every time I got to the point where I think it's too much, because it swaps from scene to scene quite a lot, from character to character. You see these different paths all converging towards this big kind of crescendo at the end. It stopped at every time when it started to feel like, would this be a bit too much, a bit too cheesy? It was either funny, clever, or moved to someone else and stopped it from becoming sort of over the top and tedious.
Yeah, I agree. And I totally get what you mean as well, with that tension of, like, is it too silly? Is it too goofy a concept to take seriously in this, because yes, it's fun and it's overblown sci-fi nonsense, but it also has some, there's some serious stuff, there's some horror stuff, there's some clever stuff in there. So is there a danger that you're going to ruin all of that other stuff by doing something as bold and ridiculous as saying, well, let's tell the story of Elvis if he's a sci-fi bounty hunter? And I think I had that same sort of fear going in. What I think worked for me, and it's the same as for you, I think, is that, I mean, it's almost a statement of intent from Kim Newman. I mean, we've seen throughout all of the Dark Future stuff he's written, even Drachenfels as well, where he kind of plays with satire and sort of theatrical satire or sort of pop culture satire, I suppose is what I mean, where he's drawing in what's the pop culture of the world and how can I make that reflect or advance or enhance and enrich the story I'm telling. And he's sort of found the ultimate way of doing it. He's taken a real life legend, because I think, because I have the same experience of Elvis as you. I'm not a big fan myself, but he was a pop culture icon for so long and at such a scale, unrivaled or nearly unrivaled. So he is a legend in he was real, but he's also become this mythical figure as well. And Kim Newman's taken that myth and reworked it and turned him into this sort of folk hero in a sci-fi Western. And so I think there is, because I was even at one point, I was a bit like, oh, is it disrespectful to take someone who really existed and to tell the story like this about them? But I think because it is leaning into those kind of mythical elements, and there's also so much evidence of deep research. I mean, Kim Newman even puts a note at the end of the book where he talks about all of the reading he did and the various biographies he read. And a lot of that comes through. There's so much detail about the character of Elvis drawn from the real person of Elvis up to a point.
Yeah, it felt real. That I'm interrupting you, but I was, as I was reading it, I was thinking he's either actually a fan, and really knows this, or he's done a lot of work here.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree, and I think he manages to find a lot of themes and a lot of threads that go from the real history, and then they sort of pass through the kind of dark futurification of the timeline, and then go into and actually here is where hope and goodness ended up in a world that is a dark future. So it's not bleak and totally dystopian, because there are some good people still, and here is one of those.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to move to another piece of it that I think makes the Elvis stuff really pop, as it were, is the use of the music and the magic. And this is jumping ahead to the kind of climax of the book, really. But it's interesting to me that we read Storm Warriors relatively recently, and one of my favorite things in Storm Warriors was this idea of musical magic. So there's a duel between bards, and they sort of play their magic, and it was like my favorite part in that book. And here again, we have this really cool, just this very innovative scene, I suppose, an idea, this creative kind of use of magic that flows through music. And it was quite an affecting scene, I thought. It worked really, really well.
Yeah, really good. It's very busy, and we are skipping right to the end, and I'm conscious of not getting too far into that part, but it's quite a long scene, isn't it? That while there are moments of the whole battle scene and the build up to the end is almost the last third of the book, really, the third part. And it's very well written, but there is a lot going on. But I think it just about handled it as well. It didn't get to the point where it got too messy. I think you're similar to me, that you're not a massive fan of really, really long action sequences in books, because it just gets a bit.
I just lose myself. I don't follow them as well. I lose the geography and like where are people stood and what's happening. So I quite like neat and short fights.
Yes, I much prefer dialogue than I read both the stories I read about are to do with combat or war or something, which is bizarre. But I do do prefer the dialogue and the stuff that leads up to it. But yeah, but it was very well written, and it was really unique. I didn't see it coming, so to speak. Maybe there were lots of guides to it because he performs a few times when asked to by different people in the story, or a couple of times prior to it. So maybe those should have been clues that he was going to perform music at the end as well. But I didn't know it was coming. But it made sense, because what else was he going to do, I suppose? And because of the magic that's in Kim Newman's version of Dark Future, it makes total sense that something like that had happened. And it was cool. It was good fun.
Yeah, and it does. I think it flows well from, because obviously we'd had the hints of the sort of chaos and the sort of darkness and the demons right from the very start. You know, in Route 666 there was a vision of demons. In Demon Download there was a literal demon that took over a sort of it was a virus that went into computers, but it was still this kind of like demon gremlin that was running around. So there's always been this magical element. We got a giant ancient god turned up in the end of Crocodile Tears, and we know that Crocodile herself is actually sort of possessed, or is the host for some ancient adversary of the bad guys. So there's all the magic and stuff like that is throughout, but it kind of it was explored in a new way in this book, I think, and it worked quite well. But then at the same time, and you're right, that's the end. So we'll loop back around to it. But at the same time as you've got more of that sort of stuff, more of this kind of folklore magic stuff that's leaning on the American South. You know, there's a lot of interesting influences in the story there. You've also got this story of like bioengineered horror. Yeah. So in parallel to what's happening with Elvis and Crocodile as they make their way to Cape Canaveral, we've got this Gentech facility where we're introduced to this character of Shiba, who's a Japanese executive who's come over from Japan to be the administrator for this facility. He doesn't really know everything that's happening there. He's just to sort of keep everyone in order and keep things moving forward. But ultimately, it turns out that they've been experimenting on slaves, essentially, indentured slaves, in order to try and combine human and reptilian DNA.
Yep.
For some reason, and it doesn't even. What's interesting is like they don't even Shiba himself, when he finds this out, can't see why. There's no real reason to do it. Is it just like a Frankenstein sort of, this wild experiment for the sake of it? But Shiba unfortunately ends up getting infected himself, and he becomes a alligator man.
It's fun, isn't it? Again, and it almost shouldn't be. If you were talking about this, you were putting together a synopsis for a book, and you're saying, well, and you'd be like, well, what's this bit in there for? You've got the same, or mostly, apart from Elvis, the same characters that you've had before. We knew that they were going to be battling again. We knew they were going to meet again, and so why bring these extra people in? But I think it helps the story quite a lot. It helps, gives you that whole connection with that kind of swamp bayou kind of feel, Louisiana. Then you got Florida as well, that whole deep south. You're imagining heat, the wars of cricket, all that. It just really adds to that flavor and changes the location away from the desert which we had before. It gives you a view from a different part of US in this dark future world. And because it brings them all together at the end anyway, I suppose it provides the good side, if they're good, an army as well, doesn't it? It just sort of, so it provides them the foot troops and allies that maybe they didn't really realize they were going to have at the beginning. But it just gives them the excuse to write some fun stuff about, about crocodile humans. It is good fun.
It's a very good point, actually, about the complete difference in the setting. Because, like you say, what we've read so far essentially has been in that Mad Max kind of Dust Bowl, the middle of America, where there like nothing grows because of all of it's a dystopian world. There's been all kinds of natural disasters and man-made disasters that have tainted and destroyed so much of the ecosystem. This novel takes us into swamplands, and we get New Orleans as a sort of flooded Venice-like place. So there's some really cool stuff with that as a setting, and you're not there for very long, but there's just like a really flavorful kind of set of locations. And then from there, we get loads of stuff in the swamp, and it feels very different, but somehow does feel quite cohesive as part of this dark future world. It does feel like, okay, this is the the ecological disaster that's happened in the middle of the States looks like this. A different but equally disastrous event has happened that's changed the swampland into this. They talk about trilobites, like prehistoric trilobites that have come back to life that are just massive and huge, like leech-like trilobite. That kind of detail and world building is so good, I think, throughout.
Yeah,
because it all really feels fun. It feels like this world that you absolutely can. You could go from the PZ, the policed zones, through the desert, sort of, where all the gang cults live and the sanctioned ops are doing all that sort of stuff, to the swamps, and it would all be part of this same setting.
Yeah, it didn't feel out of place.
Yeah,
it's one of those. If you told me beforehand that those things were in it, I'd be like, oh no, this is going to spoil it, and it doesn't feel like that at all. It works completely. Really entertaining.
Well, I think
it's quite a wild ride, but
it really
in a good
is.
way.
Yeah, in a very good way. What we've talked before, I think, about we know that Dark Future at one point was pitched as a role-playing game. So before it even became a miniatures game, it was pitched as a role-playing game by Mark Gascoigne. It was then changed to suit the Richard Halliwell miniatures game, which had all the cars. So there's a real sort of hyper focus on the Mad Max kind of road warrior stuff. Kim Newman's stories then expand that out so much to a much broader. There's elements of Mad Max, sure, but then we've got Blade Runner, we've got Judge Dredd, we've got loads of stuff like that, Cursed Earth, all of this kind of melting pot. I would love to see the RPG that was produced after these novels. Like, if that could have been possible, take all of the cool stuff from Mark Gascoigne's creation, take all of the really cool stuff from Kim Newman's expansion. And this book, more than any other, really speaks to me of just like every other page was like, okay, that's something that would be in the bestiary. The alligator mutants, they call them suitcase people, which I think was fun name. I thought, like that would be an entry in the bestiary for the game, and the different bars in New Orleans would be entries in the world guide. All of this different stuff. It was so immersive and so cool that I wanted to be in the world. I absolutely would not want to live in it because it is horrifying. But I wanted to be in it. I want to play in it. I want to spend more time in it and tell my own stories in it because it's such a good universe that's created here.
Completely
it's such
agree.
A shame it didn't.
It feels like Dark Future, the game, and I love it. It's great. It means a lot to me from what I had as a child as well. But it feels like that should be the spin-off game. That should be the Gorka Morka to the Dark Future RPG, which maybe had a skirmish game and then had Dark Future, the Road Warrior game. And maybe if battle cars hadn't existed ever, maybe it would have been an RPG and not a sort of a respin on that. I don't know. I suppose maybe it's more down to Mad Max movies, but it's good, and hopefully one day someone will try and obtain that license. Anyone watching that already has licenses for those games that makes RPGs, it would
be a great idea. Yeah, you can sign me up as the first playtester.
Well, you could write it, Jordan. There you go.
An excuse would be amazing, but because it's such a fun world, and I suppose it's kind of one of those, like, maybe the ironic point here actually is that had they made that RPG, maybe Kim Newman wouldn't have been as free to do what he did and sort of get as broad and get as out of the box as he was.
Yeah,
there's also the suggestion, that there is a finite ending to his story. So it's all building towards this kind of prophecy. We know it happens on New Year's Eve. Obviously, there's these ancient gods and the end of the world, all that kind of stuff. Maybe his version of the dark future would have had to end. Like it exists only in this 5-book cycle. But given that it did never end, and we've ended up at this kind of cut-off point.
Well, it was never a millennium bug, was there? So.
No. But yeah, it sort of feels like it's so ripe for adventure and play because it's just great fun. But in the story itself, we talked a bit about what's happening with the Gentech guys, the Sheba and ultimately lots of the other people who were being experimented on, and some of the other people who would become indentured slaves. All of them together, sort of, they are kind of building their new society of some guys who are dinosaur men. I mean, there's a very fun character who is he's a bit of a gangbanger who has become a massive, almost a T-Rex, and he's very cool as a character, and there's lots of other good characters there. That group, they're quite sympathetic in a way, and it's quite surprising actually, because Sheba, so the sort of point of view character who we join the Gentech facility through, and who accidentally gets turned into an alligator person, he arrives and he's in charge, so he's ostensibly the bad guy at that facility because he's letting all of this happen. But then Newman makes sure that he's quite sympathetic. He's the only person there who treats any of the indentured slaves with any kind of dignity, and he wants things to be done right, and he's quite respectful. So we are able to see him as a, not a fully bad guy. And then when this happens to him and he gets turned into an alligator man, we then are able to sort of side with him, and he decides to sort of forego, he steps away from his life before and embraces his new life as a suitcase person.
Yeah, quite easily as well.
I think, and maybe the suggestion is that he always wanted an excuse, and because he does talk about how he felt like he was a slave too, just in a different sort of.
But he's also quite a few. There's a few lines, and I haven't recorded any of them, but there's a few lines about he's almost quite company loyal as well.
Yes.
And there was a line or a passage when he talked about he would go back to headquarters and would try and make sure that the indentured people were set free, and these people were allowed to go on and have their own lives. They deserved it. And then he kind of occurs to him that maybe he would no longer be accepted as well.
Yes,
based on that. So there is that strange kind of, yes, he feels freer, and maybe this is more of who he really is in some ways, but also at the same time, he's still proud in many ways and loyal to Gentech, which sort of shows you that kind of, I don't know, corporate indoctrination or whatever.
Exactly that kind of. Yeah.
So it's cleverly done, but he just seemed very accepting. Really, he doesn't have the kind of meltdown you'd expect someone to at that point.
I mean, one thing that I thought was really interesting, actually, just spinning off from that, is that because obviously this is written in sometime around 89, 90, 91, it has a very particular view of American history, an Americana. Because this story it's centered around Elvis, and it is in the southern states, it also does lean into some historic tensions there, and like problems that we've seen there. Obviously, slavery being one of those, and a major factor, and racial inequality, all of that sort of stuff comes through. What we end up in the dark future, because I think what Kim Newman, sort of part of his remit, I think, is very much, okay, I'm going to take every sort of political or kind of social path and bit of progress, and I'm going to wind it back, and I'm going to say, okay, what if this is what happens to capitalism? Because and we're going to turn that up to 11 and make it to the dark future version of that. This is what happens with slavery. I'm going to turn that back up to 11. I'm going to turn this back up to 11, and so on. So everything's the worst possible timeline. You get the worst presidents, you get the worst prime ministers, all of the politicians, all of the corporate people, all of that sort of stuff is the worst you could imagine. And because of that, you get the ecological disasters and everything else. In this world, essentially, we see that slavery is back in America, and they call them indentees because they're indentured workers, ostensibly, but really they're slaves. And there's quite a lot of stuff around that, and I thought that was quite interesting, especially to tie that into like Elvis as a character and the
Yeah.
roots of his music. Obviously, in real life, a lot of Elvis's music was rooted in classically black music and sort of building off of some of that stuff. So bringing all of that into the mix, I thought was quite interesting, quite a bold approach, and sort of obviously it has a particular perspective that we may have moved on from to now, but it added a real richness and complexity to the story, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously the indentured, the modern day slaves of the Dark Future universe was just people from all different backgrounds as well. A lot of them were migrants from south of the border, weren't they? It seems South American, it seems. But there was the Ku Klux Klan's also in this story as well. And they are very much the bad guys, as you would expect. And then I think that the story is told of its time, shall we say? So, I don't mean that in its slightly problematic, because I don't think it is, but it's told within the sensibility of a film in the 80s that maybe handled those kind of things. So, prior to recording, we were talking about this a little bit. For me, it reminded me of films set in the Deep South that were maybe filmed in the 50s or something, or American Civil War based film that was out in the 80s or early 90s, and the language and things that were used were very, very much anti anything you'd expect them to be, but also not the kind of language we would describe it differently today. Would be even more sympathetic and sensible about the language we use to describe it. But I did like it there. I think it made the story feel this is a grim world where people don't care, or corporations don't care about people. Governments are weak. Bad people are doing bad things on a grand scale. And it would almost feel a little bit strange if all of those things were eliminated. That makes sense. So it feels realistic, has an element of realism and grittiness that is there. And it's not handled badly at all. But it does feel a bit old school in terms of the way certain characters are portrayed. A little bit comic book-esque, a little bit sort of Saturday afternoon Western sort of feel to it, rather than the way it would be handled now. But again,
I think that's fair. Because it's also even
years old. So.
Sure. And even when you look at like who the bad guys are, how they present themselves, like you mentioned, the KKK are in it, and there's this sort of Confederate group, the Good Old Boys, which is a sanctioned op group that are also on that sort of that they are very clearly the bad guys, and they at times are kind of caricatures of bad guys. So there's probably not as much subtlety as you might see, and not as much subtlety as you might see in real life with some of this stuff, because there's a lot of actually surprisingly relevant sort of predictions and kind of salient bits of satire and sort of things of if they're going to go bad, they'd go bad in this particular way, and we may have seen some of that in real life, oddly enough. But it does. I mean, he manages. I think Kim Newman manages to find some really interesting ways to explore that stuff, even if at times it is a little bit cartoony, and I can totally forgive and accept that in a book that has special operative Elvis Presley.
Yeah, the whole thing's a cartoon, isn't it?
It is a cartoon.
If this wasn't by GW, this would be written for 2000 AD. This is exactly 100%, what this
absolutely, is. And because he still has his 50s Cadillac, his pink Cadillac that he bought for his mom, that's been kept in pristine condition, upgraded with all of the new technology. And then at one point, and I think if I'd told myself this was going to happen or knew this was going to happen, I would think it was ridiculous and just would make the book rubbish. But at one point, after they've been driving for ages, they end up having to go into the swamps, and essentially the car has an inflatable boat thing that allows them to. It's then an amphibious Cadillac that they then ride around in the swamps. it's so silly and very goofy, and yet I was fully willing to accept it, and I was just like, yeah, okay. And then what happened?
Those things really exist as well, though, Jordan. No, maybe not for pink Cadillacs, but those things have been used in one form or another.
It
The Second
reminded
World
me
War,
of
getting tanks onto the beaches in Normandy, they had
sure, but
inflatable
yes,
things. But I know
I'm
what
sure
you
that
mean.
was
It
not
did seem a
first
little bit
deployment out of the back of a Cadillac. Yeah,
not out of a pink Cadillac. No.
yeah, and it was. You know, it's almost like I can forget which James Bond it is, but there's a car that converts into going underwater, and it's that kind of silliness. But it's acceptable because it then leads into some really cool scenes where they're riding along in the swamp and they go to a diner, and it turns out the diner is populated by evil robots. And there's a really cool action scene where they're fighting against evil robots, and then an alligator man steals the Cadillac and drives off. So there's like these moments when it's like, oh, okay, you know, it's very outlandish, but it had me the whole way. You know, at no point was I actually, you know, like I say, I think if I'd known some of these specific plot points ahead of time, even with my confidence in Kim Newman's writing, I probably would have been a bit like, okay, I don't think I'm going to like that. And yet, I did enjoy it. I enjoyed every moment of it.
Yeah, I concur. Yeah, I forgot about the Waltons, isn't it?
Yes, the Waltons. That's right.
No John Boyce, no good nights. No, it's just loads of fun stuff like that all the way through, really.
Because it's really inventive, and like you say, you know, it is kind of 2000 AD-esque, and they're all because a lot of these are like little vignettes as well. So you're getting specific scenes because Newman continues to write in a sort of filmic kind of way, a cinematic sort of approach, where it's like scene to scene to scene. Okay, this would be an action set piece. This would be an action set piece, and so on. But so those Waltons, those robots, are actually the Josephites. They're members of Elder Seth's sort of cult, essentially, who have gone to Cape Canaveral in order to reactivate this NASA satellite. And then we get that story progressing along. Duroc, the second in command, we get a lot more of him, and he sort of seems to be doubting things a little bit. He knows the end of the world is coming, so maybe he's sort of getting a bit lax and having a few last moments of, you know, letting himself go. That is really interesting. It humanizes Duroc quite a lot, to the point that I would have been really interested to see what happened with him in the final book in the series. Is he going to betray the Elder Seth and sort of come good, or is he just going to disappear? You know, like there's a fascinating storyline for him, I think.
I agree. He's sort of with his sort of new lady on his arm, Simone, isn't it? And you see their relationship grow, and there's clearly a bit of care toward for each other towards the end. As much as it seems hard to believe that he would care about anyone, but that kind of brash, almost arrogant lieutenant of, or say lieutenant, I suppose, if it's in America, of Seth, softens throughout this. And I think her character feels like it's got something to do with that a little bit, or at least makes him think about humanity a little bit more, his connection with her. Well, most of the connection with her is very, I suppose, a service-related one in many ways.
Sure, yes.
And gratuitous in terms of a relationship, not in the way it's portrayed in the story. But yeah, he's an interesting character. Unfortunately, we won't get to find out what that final chapter in his tale was like. But it's good to see him sort of rescued at the end and not die, really, because you kind of think, and then you remember, there is another one.
Similar to Ottokar from the previous story, the serial killer. He's mentioned. He's back in prison and in an asylum, so he's still on the table as a potential character as well that we could see more from. But yeah, Duroc remains alive, still has a part to play in the story, but the way in which the end comes about is, I mean, again, this was quite surprising to me and I was not expecting, but so they're at Cape Canaveral, they're trying to reactivate the NASA systems, they're trying to get this evil laser satellite back online, And there's sort of over the course of the novel, we sort of see him getting closer and closer to that. But we also know the commander that they've brought back from the old NASA days is seeing ghosts, essentially. And then,
yeah.
like, all of the different astronauts that have died throughout the course of the space program are sort of appearing to him as ghosts, and they're sort of mouthing things to him, and he can't quite understand what it is. We later understand that they consider him a traitor for what he's doing. And there's this kind of interesting, almost this extra story going on around. I mean, essentially, we find out that the space program only worked because of blood sacrifice, and that the people, I think it's a fascinating idea. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So the Josephites managed to get things going again by sacrificing goats and bloodletting into the NASA computers, which obviously, again, ridiculous, but it's a perfect combination of like chaotic magic and technology. And then this sort of broader point being that, the only way that they were able to get, so in the Dark Future universe, they've had a man on Mars and they've been able to build these space stations and stuff. And it is because of blood sacrifice, the blood and the sweat and the tears that went into making it possible, but literally so, because technology is powered by magic to an extent, which I thought was just a really cool kind of relatively subtle. It's not that subtle, but relatively.
It doesn't sound it when you say it out loud, but I know what you mean. It read a little bit more.
It's
subtle.
It's not explicitly. No one actually sits there and goes, "Oh yeah, the space program only worked because of." But that's in there. I think that's a really fun idea, and I think that would be something that you could explore again. Whether it's a role playing game, whether it's other stories, because the dark future of this setting, everyone is so tied to their technology. I mean, you look at the game, you look at all the stories, cars, guns, absolutely essential to survival in this world. And what we now are discovering is that all of that technology is sort of magically driven to some extent.
Yeah.
That presents like a really fun, it's like, I'm sure there's a term for it, whether it's like gear punk or oil punk or something. Like, there's something in there around like magic and technology and the kind of two things working together. And it felt like quite a big revelation that's just in the background of the story. It's really cool. I really like that.
Yeah, there's a whole nother story there. There's a whole nother RPG module.
Yeah, and so that also allows you to sort of get away with. I mean, we've seen moments in previous stories where, like, the willpower of someone kind of coincides with their car just getting them to the line, or the gun just being able to take the final shot. So you can kind of like have that magical, that Deus Ex Machina explained by the way in which the universe works.
Yeah,
which is cool.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. It's just thinking about the my mind was going off on spaceships and sacrifices from a moment. I was thinking, this is it just shows the amount of possibilities in this story to expand it off in different directions, and how they could have been different short stories on their own. It's there's a lot packed into it, and again, but it's a wild story. There's lots of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it moves at quite a clip, though, doesn't it? As well, I think. It's only 240 pages,
230 to 40 pages. Yeah. And like I said, that kind of, it feels like that whole final part 3, is very much the battle scene. There's breaks in it, but there's conflict all the way through, and it's all building towards the final battle. And then it does kind of end fairly quickly once it ends.
It does.
Done. And we're on to the author's notes.
Yeah,
I thought there was going to be some kind of mopping up chapter at the end.
Yeah, like a bit more of an epilogue.
There wasn't at all.
Yeah, because you do, like you say, the battle, sort of the third act, we end up getting Elvis teams up with the crocodile people, the suitcase people. They have the common enemy of the Josephites. The Josephites, there's a really cool device. Yet again, we saw something similar in Crocodile Tears, where Crocodile was taking out ops during an attack on a village. And Kim Newman kept cutting back to the numbers of the good guys and the bad guys, and those numbers were ticking down as people were getting killed. And it was this ticking clock that progressed the scene. We have something very similar here, which is the code words that they're having to put in, the Josephites are having to put into the NASA computer in order to get it to acknowledge their control of the satellite.
Yeah.
And they're just combinations of words, sort of call and response. But we keep going back to that in between the suitcase people, like landing on the beaches and attacking the Josephite compound. Elvis is rolling around, firing and taking out robots and all that sort of stuff. Crocodile turns up in the Cadillac that she's been able to find and get back from the guy who stole it. So all of this big action scene is happening, and those ghosts that we know are turning up are starting to sort of become a bit more tangible, and they're sort of they're sort of appearing, and that is where we then ultimately end up with Elvis doing his magic, right? Because it all becomes clear that Elvis needs to play some music and do some magic in order to kind of, I don't know, give the ghosts more tangibility, kind of give them the right magical whatever in order to affect the universe.
Yeah, it's not quite a seance, is it? But it's got those kind of almost draws them more to action, I suppose. But you were right. So you're talking about those markers. It's almost like that countdown, and because we're constantly swapping between these different parts, these main characters, so the ghosts, and we've got the suitcase people, you've got Elvis, you've got Crocodile, and then you get those countdown bits again. It just builds that tempo, doesn't it? Especially with the battle scene. And it's a really clever writing device. And I didn't really think about it before until you mentioned that it was the same as the countdown for the kill count, and he's done it before. It's obviously a deliberate thing because it builds some sort of jeopardy and tempo into. It's
brilliant.
So it's like having a score. You can imagine a score in a film. Again, back to Newman and writing in a way that it reads like a film, and it does build that kind of. You can imagine it changing from scene to scene, and the excitement building towards the end.
Completely, yeah. And then, like you say, the sort of Elvis. That moment, so it was really cool because there's been loads of talk throughout the book about lots of different influences and friends of Elvis and like people whose music he loved and all that sort of stuff. His own songs as well get referenced plenty of times throughout. It was only during this scene though when we kind of get this kind of, there's like a little flashback to Buddy Holly. And the day the music died, and you kind of get this moment of them getting onto the plane, and it's the suggested final words of Buddy Holly that the sky belongs to the stars, which is actually the subtitle for the book in some editions, and there's this really interesting idea, I think, that when Elvis plays a song, he picks a Buddy Holly song, not one of his own songs, to start with when he's sort of performing this magic. And the flashback gives you the sense that it connects Elvis by the act of playing the music, playing the song. He's connected to this previous artist, and sort of is almost reaching back and bringing Buddy Holly back to life. And then, together they're then speaking to the ghosts. And, it is this, because I actually think music is a form of magic, really, because it's the effect that it can have on me is like, and people generally, it's transformative. I think, you listen to music and it can have an enormous emotional and sometimes even physical effect on people. So the idea that it's literally magic, I think, is really compelling to me at least. And when he starts playing this Buddy Holly song every day, I was compelled to put it on. I was like, okay, I need to be listening to this song, even though it wasn't an Elvis version, whilst I'm reading this scene. And it just worked so well. And it is really, really good because he talks about how the fact that the lyrics of the song seem like they're about, love and lovers, but actually it could be this sort of chaos that's coming and the end of the world that's coming. So it reinterprets the song as well. Just a really good scene, just really, really powerful scene. And like Crocodile ends up literally crying. We get the crocodile tears for real in the scene. because of the impact of the music. And the magical impact is that the ghosts are given enough tangibility to essentially form a ghost rocket that fires into the satellite and destroys it. So it's, again, outlandish, but also somehow right. It just works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very hard to ghost rocket. Yeah, when you put it like that, it just seems, again, another example of it seeming absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
I wonder if anyone was watching this and thinks, I'm going to go and read that. That sounds really good. Or just thinking, well, what are they on about? This sounds awful.
Because I mean, it does just the plain sort of bullet points of the story. They're hard to do justice because it's in the writing, it's the way the story is told, it's the way the music is played that makes it so impactful. Yeah. And we just get that again and again.
Yeah.
It really is just, putting together all these different notes, it comes together into something that sounds better than the sum of its parts. Yeah, I mean, it's had a magical effect on me, Stu, I think. I'm really quite taken with Kim Newman's Dark Future.
I thought you were going to say you've decided to learn the guitar. You're going to play us out.
Yeah, that is chaotic magic that nobody needs to hear. That's cursed music is what that would be.
That would be an Easter egg at the end of the video.
But yeah, it was a fitting climax to this story. I mean, we talked on so I do the Patreon live stream for every book club and just chat with my patrons about the book. There was a certain bittersweet sense for a lot of people around the fact that, yeah, it was a really good story, but it's almost undermined to an extent because it's kind of it's a little bit Empire Strikes Back. It's you're kind of leaving off with, we know there's another mission to come. We know the world still needs saving. I mean, even like we say, there was no epilogue, so we didn't get any kind of real conclusion to anybody. Elvis says to Crocodile, I'll come and help with whatever it is you're doing. And she says, no, you go back and don't worry about it. Obviously, well, and one assumes Elvis would have been called into action again. So you kind of get, there's this slight, like, dissatisfying, because we know there was more, there should have been more. The story isn't finished, and that, makes you a bit sad when you get to the end.
It's odd that they didn't return to it. I appreciate why they didn't put it in this initial run, but when Box Tree, when there were the extra titles added, it's odd that they didn't finish it off. But I suppose maybe at that time the commerciality around it was a little bit tighter, and it was like, are we producing this game anymore?
Yeah,
and that was probably why.
It seems like, right.
And there were obviously we talked about the 2005 versions, but again, different publisher, different reasons, new books, but maybe also at the same time they didn't contact Kim Newman, or maybe he wasn't interested, or maybe they couldn't afford him, or who knows what the reasons were at that time.
I'm sure there were reasons, but we know at the same time Newman was brought back to Black Library to tell more Genevieve stories, only briefly, but there was a little bit of extra writing commissioned by Black Library. So it just, I imagine you're right, and it's the commerciality, and it just wasn't, whoever was counting the beans at the time just didn't think it was going to be worth investing it, or the time wasn't there, or other projects got in the way, that sort of stuff. But it's such a shame, I think, that GW books, the run ends before the saga is complete. Box Tree, they end before the saga is completed, and then Black Flame also ends before the saga is completed. 3 attempts, 3 chances to finish the Demon Download saga, and they all missed. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's a certain, we're talking about Dark Future and Kim Newman's writing being like, what if it's the worst of every timeline? What if the most dissatisfying thing happened at every election in every country? Everything that could go wrong does go wrong. And that the ultimate expression of that is that the story is never finished, and that that is the dark future.
Maybe that's the setting, and you don't finish the story because that's to play in your role play games.
Well, maybe, yeah,
that's the setting. The setting
is it could well be
at that point. That very much Games Workshop style of that 2 minutes to midnight or whatever it comes to. But yeah, I suppose at least if you do play games, and there's nothing to stop people role playing this with any of the existing systems are out there. I'm sure it could be easily done, or whatever all games you play with it. Then it's good for that. It's good for people who want to explore the world themselves. But if you just want to find out what Kim Newman had in mind, it's a shame that's not available.
Yeah, it's such a surprisingly rich world, I think, given that the game, there's some really cool lore and some really cool stuff in the game itself, and the advertising for the game as well, but it is quite slight. It's one boxed game. It's a number of articles in White Dwarf. It was not developed over many years. There's not loads of additions, loads of supplements, so it is a very limited world just from the game. What we get in the books deepens and broadens it so much. Like, it is genuinely wild to me to think that of the GW books range, and we've still got a couple more to go, but of the original 17 GW books, the most consistent and probably most almost timeless of the books are not the Warhammer Fantasy or the 40k ones. They're the Dark Future ones, which was a game that was almost dead before the books were being published and would never come back to life. That is just a very curious state of affairs, I think.
Yes.
Very unexpected, unpredictable, really, and yet so rewarding, so much fun, such a pleasant surprise.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I just really wish that he could be tempted to write the story. Do you? I can't remember. I've seen your interview with him.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember whether he said whether he'd written it or whether it was just a kind of an outline.
So I think I don't think, and again, I will go back and check myself. My recollection may be faulty, but I don't think it's like a complete manuscript sat on a computer somewhere. I think it was more, here's the notes, here's the outline, here's what would have happened. What I think we will do here on the Books Club is we've got one more Dark Future book. It's not part of the sort of the Demon Download saga. It's not written by Kim Newman, but it's the next book we're going to read. It's by Brian Craig. It's called Ghost Dancer. It does link to one of the short stories we've seen in the Route 666 collection. We know characters who we've interacted with or heard from in the Kim Newman stories are in it. So, there's still some more story to tell. We've still got a bit more Dark Future to explore. Once we've read that, I think we can maybe do a bit of a retrospective. I mean, we've sort of done a lot of it already because it's, that's just the feelings come alive. But I think maybe we can take a moment to sort of take a look at all of the evidence we've got, all of the knowledge and information we have about where the story might have gone. And we could literally speculate, I suppose, on how we think it might have played out. Fun. Yeah. But yes, Ghost Dancers is coming up next. We are going to be taking, though, a month break. So we're not going to be on in December. So January is when we're going to be back with the Ghost Dancers book. And then we've only got one more of the original GW books left after that, which is Beasts in Velvet, which is another Kim Newman writing as Jack Yeovil book. So hoping to go out on a high. I'd be surprised if it's not, but there's been plenty of surprises in the GW,
I'm sure
GW
it will
books
be
project. Awesome. Any final thoughts, Stu, on Comeback Tour overall? I
don't know. Just fun, really. Nothing to add in terms of any more insight. But if you're watching this and you haven't read it, do give it a go. It is really good fun. In fact, any of the Kim Newman books in the series, but definitely if you're going to pick out, if you're interested in Dark Future, if you've not read any, just pick out his stories, his shorts, and his full-length novels, because they're just really good. And it tells a very, very interesting version of the Dark Future universe, which works nicely alongside that of the game. Doesn't feel out of place. It feels like a potential expansion of it. So yeah, go read it. It's good fun.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed. Highly recommended, I think. Yeah. Would you give this a thumbs up or a thumbs down, Stu?
Hell yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Thumbs up.
Huge thumbs up. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree for sure. Well, I mean, I think, we've enjoyed all of the Kim Newman stories, I think, across the GW book so far. Like we say, we've got one more to go, so that's quite exciting. I think the Dark Future has been a real high point so far. Just fantastic stories. This comeback tour, actually, I mean, I guess, when we get to the end of the original run, there's plenty more books we're going to read in the future as part of the books club. But we are also going to take a look at maybe doing some sort of ranking or tier list or something like that. But whilst we're just here in the midst of the Kim Newman stories, any sort of initial thoughts on where this ranks compared to the other Dark Future stories he wrote?
I don't know. Generally don't know. I think I'm an R too long to make it good viewing. I don't know if it's.
I mean, if there's no light between them, if they're that close.
Yeah, there's not. They're close enough that it's might just depend on what mood. It's hard to choose.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, I'm surprised how much I enjoyed this one, actually. But I think, I think I remember seeing this one on the shelves for a long time. I used to work in a Waterstones, and we had the reissued ones on the shelves for a long time. Comeback Tour always leapt out to me. It was always the one that I almost read. So I don't know if that's sort of playing a role as well, and kind of mixed in with my anticipation and trepidation. But I think
as a teen, I remember, I don't know if "put off's" the right phrase, but the Elvis on the cover didn't do it for me.
Yeah, because it really does set the tone, right? It's suggesting, this is like a weird pop culture.
Yeah, Elvis is what I was describing earlier. Elvis was you went to town, and the shops that sold the calendars, the cushions with Michael Jackson's face on or whatever. Elvis was the white silky pillow that your friend's grandma had or something. And that's and that definitely would have meant that I would have picked up one of the other versions instead.
Yeah, understandable.
Which is silly, but that's the way we are.
Well, I mean, I suppose actually just a final point, I suppose, is just how mature in many ways the Dark Future books, but especially this one, I feel it was definitely written for an older audience, I think, compared to a lot of the other GW books. Obviously, we talked before about the relationship that Duroc has. Obviously, Simone being a prostitute that he's essentially bought for but it's not gratuitous. There is a sexual relationship there, and it is talked about, but it is a lot deeper and more complex than you might expect. And the same thing with the various sort of racial tensions and other things like that are explored and talked about. There's a much defter hand and a much more mature hand for a lot of that stuff than you might have seen from some of the other
someone else
books in the series.
Who's coming up next? There would have been, those scenes would have been longer, definitely, and they would have made a point of being more descriptive. And it's just wasn't. It just shows that I'm no prude either. But when you're writing for potentially 15-year-olds, or even 14 up, if you're going for what's the age group that's on your boxes, this got away with it. If you're a 14-year-old, my mum would have been happy for me to read this as a mature 14-year-old. And I was a mature 14-year-old. I would have read this and I reacted in a way that it would have been a problem, so to speak. Whereas I would. My eldest is 10, so he wouldn't be reading this yet anyway. But I'd imagine at 14, I'd be happy for him to read this. Some of the others, you'd think, again, would I want to read that? I don't know. So yeah, I agree. I think it's handled very well. It just goes to show, doesn't it? You don't need to make a big play of those things. If you do it subtly, it's just as powerful, in fact, and better. Doesn't stand out for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think we can leave it there for our discussion on Comeback Tour. I think we've got a resounding thumbs up from both of us. We very much enjoyed it. And we will be continuing with Dark Future in January. Until then, where can people find you online, Stu?
Miniature Realms, YouTube channel primarily, but then all the supporting social networks that go with it as well.
Fantastic. I'll put links to all of those down below, as well as your Patreon. My Patreon and my links are all down in the description as well, at Jordan Sorcery, pretty much everywhere. And until next time, I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.